And I feel like that's a really dishonest way to interview people. You're using them as a man uses a prostitute for his own pleasure. Everyone talks about this person, but nobody, I believe, one of my missions, this is not everyone's mission, it just happens to be mine at this stage of my life, is I want to hear what people think. I guess long story short, I have concluded through much experience that some of the people screaming at me don't have the moral authority to get my attention.
In the middle of a GOP or MAGA civil war of sorts, all sorts of people are asking Tucker Carlson, why did you interview Nick Fuentes? Why did you give him a platform? Just as Sean Ryan asks him right here. Well, in this clip, Tucker Carlson explains exactly that, why this conversation has started such outrage among the neocons and Zionists. I repeat myself, especially what it tells us about American politics and what is the truth about Nick Fuentes and his beliefs. So let's watch. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Why did you decide to have Nick Fuentes on? I thought you guys
well, I of course hated Nick Fuentes, and he, well, going back to what I was just saying, he criticized my dad, also criticized my wife and my son, but
I don't know much about him.
Well, I was super pissed at him. He's 27, and he criticized my dad. In
fact, why were you pissed at him? Because he criticized your
dad? Not allowed to
criticize
my dad. I'm his oldest son. Those are just the rules. Can't stand that. My father was a flawed man.
What did he?
But a great man. Oh, CIA guy. He did all this bad shit. He was involved in Iran-Contra. And some of it was true, or sort of true, or semi-true enough, I guess. So that made it worse. It didn't matter whatever he said about my dad. But my father just died, and I was like, I can't. That just drives me absolutely insane. So, and I feel an obligation to be mad about it because it's my dad. Those are the rules. So I attacked him, and then I called him, and I was like, look, I don't know you, but I want you to know why. I always want to tell people why I don't like them, and I want to do it right to their face. And I always call people and just say, I'm going to attack you, or I did attack you, and I want you to hear why from me. I just did that yesterday to somebody. Anyway, I always do that. And so I called Nick Fuentes and I said, I want you to know why I attacked you. I attacked you because you criticized my father, and I just never going to accept that. My father was a great man and flawed, but a great man, like literally a great man. And I'm never going to accept that. And he, to his credit, was like, I get that. I get that. So, but
Interesting. I mean, that's pretty humbling, right, on both of their parts. Number one, Tucker Carlson for calling this guy and saying, hey, I criticized you, here's why. A lot of people would not have the courage even to do that about who they're criticizing, even if they could reach out to that person. And Fuentes, to his credit, for saying, I get that. This is a familial relationship. And to be clear here, there's not really direct evidence tying Tucker Carlson's father, Dick Carlson, to Iran-Contra itself, though he was involved in the CIA, certainly was involved in some of the deep, dark underbellies of the deep state. But he did seem to be involved in, the Nicaragua affair and possibly the overthrow of Manuel Noriega, who, was lambasted as, the CIA's boogeyman in 1989, right? He was the biggest threat in the world then, not the deep state that always really is the biggest threat. But I like this backstory. I mean, I like the fact that these two were at odds with each other. Whoever you ascribe the culpability in that for, Nick was attacking Tucker as early 2023. Tucker didn't seem to really even know who he was, essentially, until last year, from what I can gather. Maybe that's wrong. You tell me if I'm wrong. But, he did treat Nick unfairly too, particularly in his interview with Candace Owens. So setting this up is an interesting story that people don't want. They want people on the right that are dissidents, that oppose aid to Israel, to be at each other's throats. So it did represent an interesting moment for them to come together and share their thoughts, no matter how, perverted or backward either of their thoughts are in your mind.
I still didn't like him. I'm not friends with him now. But because of that, I got a lot of input from people like, I don't know that much about Nick Fuentes. I'm 56. I don't like the internet, so I don't really know that much. I've seen clips. He's very talented. I know that. But I'm not an expert on that at all. And I got calls from a lot of people, including some very influential people who knew a lot about Nick Fuentes. And they're like, this kid is the single most influential figure among young white men. And not just white, actually.
Is that true?
Oh, it's definitely true. I mean, it was true last month. I don't know if it's true now. I mean, everything changes. Who knows? But that was definitely my impression, and I think it's right. And in the subsequent weeks, I've asked a million different people, Nick Fuentes, and like, yes, he's extremely influential among young men.
Yeah, I think that's undeniable. I mean, I haven't looked at the empirics to support this, but just looking at some of the basic metrics, just in a week, he's gained about 40,000 new subscribers on Rumble. He has 541,000 subscribers right now, and he had a 500,000 just a week ago. You know, I've watched his show quite a bit throughout time, especially lately. And, you know, this guy, despite every attempt to cancel him, has excelled beyond imagination. He's ascended in ways because, in some ways, about his backstory being propelled by the neocons and Zionists of sorts. Actually, when he got politically charged, it was because of back and forth with Ben Shapiro on Twitter. He talked about that in his interview with Tucker, and there's Streisand affecting the hell out of this guy. And what I mean by that is that they're talking about him and giving people a reason to actually pay attention to his ideas where they otherwise might not, because there's so much focus from the Mark Levins and from the Ben Shapiros and Randy Fines and Lindsey Grahams and the political establishment saying, don't listen to this kid. This kid's horrible. He's the worst human being on the planet. I mean, this is said by people that support the mass murder of innocents overseas in every war, by the way. And because so many people see that and can't stand these neocons and Zionists, they actually do follow Nick Fuentes and, hey, might have said, hey, I'm going to check out what he's all about now. I think that explains a lot of propelling him to stardom, even regardless of any of his actual views.
Wow, how young? What age?
They're 20s, teens and 20s, college students, high school students, college students, just out of college, can't find a job. You know, they can't find jobs, right? A lot of this, by the way, a lot of the frustration is economic, which no one wants to talk about or seems invited to talk about. It's not about the Jews. It's about the economy. And it's about the betrayal that young men feel when they go through all these hoops and get all these stupid degrees and find out they're worth nothing. And they're in $300,000 in debt. And like, I did what you told me to do and I'm fucked. So I'm mad at you. And why wouldn't they be? They have every right to be. That's my personal opinion, but it's just true. Anyway, and a lot of those men watch Nick Fuentes. So it's like, Nick Fuentes is one of those figures that everybody, like Putin, that's why I interviewed Putin. Everyone talks about this person, but nobody, I believe, one of my missions, this is not everyone's mission, it just happens to be mine at this stage of my life, is I want to hear what people think. And I want to give people a chance to speak for themselves. Because I think every person from Idi Amin to Mother Teresa has an inherent right to tell their own story. And you can disagree with the story and you can doubt the story and you can do whatever you want. But to say they don't have a right to tell their story, I just reject that. I disagree.
Absolutely. I do too. This is how a good journalist thinks of these things, by the way, and considers the world and information and the dissemination of information and how it is important for people of prominence to be heard. And for the people at large to either reject or accept that. He applied that same theorem to interviewing Putin and to interviewing the president of Iran. This is what good journalists do. And you're just taking cues from the worst people imaginable if you're saying, hey, this person is horrible. They've amassed such a following for the wrong reasons. Well, why don't we get to the bottom of that? And if it is really for the wrong reasons, shouldn't it be low-hanging fruit for them to be able to be exposed by you? By seeing, you know, their worst ideas come to form in the kind of form of these podcasts, that you can rip them. That should be the point of good journalism. And I agree with Tucker. A lot of this is probably considered to be the result of just complete disenfranchisement, economic disenfranchisement of the populace by rampant spending campaigns and by rampant inflation. You know, there's lots of campaigns to pin this on foreign countries like China, but it really is the United States and our criminal government that sells people down the river because of inflation that they cause through the printing of additional money that imposes a tax on all of us. Through the regulatory apparatus, people have a hard time starting new businesses. From corporate welfare, sending our money to the biggest and well-connected corporations in America over, you know, sending that back to the taxpayers maybe. Maybe people shouldn't have to pay taxes for this evil empire that's trying to prioritize Israel over the United States. How about that?
I disagree. And I feel like it's not my only mission in life, but that's one of my beliefs. And I've done what I can my limited attention and means to like give people a place to tell their story. Why should people on the internet have a right to define anybody with 2-minute clips, and that person doesn't have a right to tell his own story? I just reject that. I don't care. I reject that whether it's Hillary Clinton or Nick Fuentes or anyone in between. People have a right to say what they think. And if you want to watch it, don't. So I just believe that, and I'll never stop believing that. And if they don't have that right, what you're really saying is other people have a right to speak for someone else. And they don't. They don't, because we're all created by God and we all have the right to say what we think. So I believe that. So I was like, yeah, if I have Nick Fuentes on, obviously probably some people will criticize me just as they did with Putin. You know, you love Nick Fuentes. You agree with everything he says. No, I've interviewed war criminals in Liberia. I've interviewed cannibals. I kind of liked them, just being honest. I kind of like everybody I interview.
You guys break bread together?
Me and the cannibals? No. And by the way, this was in Africa, and I did not lecture them about cannibalism, which I'm totally opposed to. But anyway, so I did, and it was really interesting. And I try not to lecture people just in general, because I don't like being lectured at all. And I don't think most people do. And I think the purpose of lecturing people usually is self-aggrandizing. The point of lecturing, Sean Ryan, you're a bad person. Unlike me, I'm a great person. I don't have the need to convince people I'm a great person at all. I just don't feel that need. They can decide for themselves. And I feel like that's a really dishonest way to interview people. You're using them as a man uses a prostitute for his own pleasure. So I'm using you to make a statement about myself. I'm not doing that. I don't need to do it. I don't want to do it, and I'm not doing it.
Well, that's heroic as far as I'm concerned. That's about the best take he's had in this entire interview, that so many interviews are conducted just for self-aggrandizement, for promoting your own views, for promoting your own touch. And there's a place for that. Actually, there's a place for that in content creation. That I can't escape that. I do that to some extent. But when you're talking to a person and getting to the bottom of what they truly think and whether those ideas are wise or not, people can sort that kind of thing out for themselves. It doesn't have to all be about you. And so many of Tucker's criticisms, from other people, critiques of Tucker Carlson, especially from the Zionists and the neocons, would say, hey, someone will say, I'm trying to steel man them. They'll say, we totally believe in free speech. We don't think that, the government should step in and stop these conversations from happening. But at the same thing, Tucker Carlson should only have the guests we want him to have. Well, it's like, no, Tucker Carlson isn't a monster that supports every war under the sun and every, tax extortion device to fund those wars overseas. He has a different set of priorities that are not yours. And thankfully he does, because he doesn't want to push things in the direction of all-out war no matter what, CIA deep state plots to rob us of our liberty, propagandize us for their next war, fund the next CARES Act and billions of dollars down the drain from American taxpayers to corporations. He can prioritize things the way he wants, and he does it darn well better than the neocons, I'll tell you that.
So I'm not going to lecture Putin about his war crimes. You can read about Putin all you want. I want to hear what Putin says. And I took that exact same approach with Nick Fuentes. And I knew there would be, an outcry or whatever. Probably understated it a little bit. But, not up to me. But my conscience is clear. One of the only parts that kind of bothered me, but now it amuses me, is there was a point in the interview where Nick Fuentes said, really out of nowhere, I love Stalin. It's like, Joseph Stalin? And he's like, yeah, I love Stalin. I mean, this was not relevant to what we were talking about at all. It was out of the blue. So I said,
had to get it in there, huh?
I guess. He had like a need to tell me he loved Stalin. So I made a snap decision. I said something like, I don't know what you're talking about. We'll get back to that. And then, of course, I got completely sidetracked and forgotten, didn't get back to it. And I was criticized. I didn't get back to it. It's fair, I guess. My instinct really was, he's just saying that. He probably doesn't know much about Stalin. I actually do know a lot about Stalin. It's like the only thing I studied in college, and I'm interested in the topic. Maybe he does know a lot about Stalin. I don't know. But I do, actually, and I have a lot of thoughts on Stalin. It's a very interesting topic. And people flipped out about that and accused me of loving Stalin. And what I find amusing about that is those exact same people were also getting mad at me for questioning the course of the Second World War and the conclusions that we're drawing from it. Now, my main problem with America's involvement in the Second World War was the fact that we sided with Stalin and armed Stalin and made it possible for Stalin to fight that war through a program called Lend-Lease, which was passed, I think, in the fall of 1941 with a unanimous vote among Democrats in the Congress. And Stalin was the greatest murderer in history by some counts. Stalin, Mao, pick one, but Stalin has a right to be called that, and was definitely unchallenged the most prolific murderer of Christians in history, genocider of Christians, and murderer of priests and a destroyer of churches, and like a true enemy of Christianity.
Yeah, certainly so. No doubt about that. Stalin is either, if you want to put it number one or number two, the biggest mass murderer in human history. You could attribute that title to Mao Zedong or Stalin, no matter whether you think, the other killed more people or less. In that benchmark, it is one of those two. I mean, Hitler is universally considered the worst, but his stacked corpses didn't amount to 20 to 50 million people, as people attribute it to Stalin. Even some, historians that are more warm to Stalin, and believe it or not, there are those people, put it at the lower end. Higher end people put it at about 50 million. So yeah, Stalin's purges of the military, the Holodomor in the Ukraine was an effort to seize the grain reserves from those poor, beleaguered people there starving. Michael Malice writes a lot about this in his book, The White Pill. It's fantastic. Pick that up and read it. But yeah, that's a crazy comment by Fuentes, for sure. It probably wasn't the subject that Tucker had intended to interview him about, but it would have been an interesting conversation. I would love to hear them say that. And Nick, in trying to defend this, has released something like a 30-minute video. I watched the whole thing, and trying to be the most charitable possible, my interpretation of his argument for why he says that about Stalin is Stalin, no matter how, atrocious he was, and he was a monster, Nick has said that, but he was incredibly effective at consolidating power and bending people to his will. And it's like, yeah, but you said you admire him, and I'm still not convinced those are admirable traits. So, he eventually tried to switch the goalposts at times and say, well, no, I wasn't saying I admired him. It's just, here's why he should be studied. And, well, that wasn't your original argument. So that's my interpretation. It's an absurd take, and I would have loved them to talk about it. But at the same time, they were talking about other subject matter too, so it's just how the conversation drifted. I would have loved to have seen that, though.
Killed tens of millions of Christians. And the U.S. government sent him billions and billions, adjusted for inflation, but billions of dollars in cash and clothing and war material and airplanes and tanks and jeeps. I mean, we armed the Red Army. We armed Stalin. To which people say, well, are you for Hitler? No, I'm totally opposed to Hitler. But I'm never going to accept arming Stalin. I'm just not. Why would I? And these same people are like, well, you had to choose. Well, no. How about, let's start here. We're not arming Stalin. We're also not going to arm Hitler. Why would we do that? You lose all moral authority. You're sending billions to Joseph Stalin of the Ukrainian famine and the purge trials and all the rest. I don't take you seriously if you arm Stalin. Why would I? It was those exact same people who jumped my shit for being pro-Stalin in this interview with Nick Fuentes. And I'm like, I don't take you seriously. I'm starting to think you'll say anything to get me to be quiet. And that just made me laugh. To myself, I had no one to talk to about this, of course, but I was amused by it. No, I'm very anti-Stalin. That's actually one of the reasons I'm mad at Churchill, because he was closely allied with Stalin. I'm mad at Roosevelt for the same reason. I'm sad about my country's involvement in a war where we sided with Stalin. And I'm bewildered that no one will say that. And that anyone who does say that is like anti-American. Well, my family's been here for like 400 years. I'm hardly anti-American. I couldn't be more pro-America.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was reasons for critiquing Stalin even beyond that. I mean, the most sensible thing, according to the American firsters, like Charles Lindbergh, an American hero back then, that didn't want to enter this war, it didn't rest on the side of, hey, Hitler's great. It's that, why should we get embroiled in a European war that's of no benefit to us? And that was the reasoning. And if you really wanted the best thing for the United States, it probably would have been better to allow two of the most totalitarian forces in human history, arguably both number one or number two. They could be number one, number two, or number three if you count Mao's China, vying against each other while the U.S. stays out of it with no benefit to the U.S. And after the war, even FDR's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, was very critical of FDR for what Churchill especially did in handing over half of Eastern Europe over to Stalin when it wasn't just a sure thing. When Stalin got 10% of Greece, he got 50% of Yugoslavia, 50% of Hungary, 75% of Bulgaria, and 90% of Romania. These percentages were disproportionately beneficial to Stalin when the US and Britain didn't have to give that much territory up potentially. It enraged some people in even FDR's administration, and parts of that administration loved Stalin and called him Uncle Joe. So yeah, there's lots of reasons to be critical of Stalin and of Churchill for how they treated Stalin. They gave him the house, much more so than Neville Chamberlain gave to Hitler, ironically enough.
And I'm pro-America because in general, we don't arm Stalin. And I don't think we should ever arm Stalin again. Or back Al-Qaeda. Or have the Al-Qaeda guy to the White House like the other day. I'm just not for that. So I guess long story short, I have concluded through much experience that some of the people screaming at me don't have the moral authority to get my attention.
Good.
Fair?
Good for you. What did you learn from that interview?
I learned that he's popular for the same reason most people are popular in unmediated media, because he's got a really compelling message, which is like 90% true, or pretty true.
What is his message?
His message is, we've been betrayed by the people who thought were on our side. We thought these people were for us. They actually sold us out. Well, that's certainly true. Israel has way too much influence over our Congress. Obviously, 95% of members of Congress take money from a foreign lobby, AIPAC. Like, how is that defensible? You can, by the way, you could be for Israel, but still be like, what is that? Why is that allowed?
Are there bigger lobbying firms than AIPAC?
Well, there are a million lobbies, and not all of them have organizations. I don't think Israel's America's biggest problem. I've never thought that. But it's certainly America's most insulting problem. It's so insulting to be ordered around by a country of 9 million people when you're the United States. Like, what? It's a totally irrelevant country. Its only relevance is we promised to protect them. Therefore, we're like involved in all this crap. You fought some of the wars.
Absolutely. It is so insulting, and more Americans are picking up on that it's not that necessarily this is the most backward aspect of America. I think it is in terms of our foreign policy. I mean, if you look at the metric of foreign aid spent, the most has been on Israel as compared to any other country. It's something like $350 billion. And that's what sucked the U.S. into wars, at least partially, in Iraq and Syria and Libya and Somalia and the war in Iran, which just happened months ago, and bankrolling and genocide in Gaza. And then the president goes out there, his administration meets with convicted Israeli spy Jonathan Pollard, who sold out American secrets to the Israelis and was welcomed by Israel for doing that, for Trump recognizing the Golan Heights, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, shredding the JCPOA, which was the thing that inhibited the potential for a war versus Iran. And all these things lining up, like we're all supposed to pretend that this is just coincidental, that the U.S. isn't beholden to Israeli influence, despite AIPAC openly boasting about they have 361 representatives in their pocket voting the way they want, which, by the way, is indistinguishable from Netanyahu's agenda. And we're supposed to still say that, no, it's Russian influence and Qatari influence that's the bigger problem in America. It's absurd. Americans are picking up on it, and Tucker Carlson's right. This is the most insulting part of it.
But if you take that out and you're just like, hey, good luck, you're great, wish you well, can't wait to go to Jerusalem next summer on vacation, which I have done and hope to do again. But if we've imbued the country with all the significance that is not deserved, there are no resources. It's the size of Maryland. It's got 9 million people. Like, this is a big world, very complicated. And somehow our Congress and successive White Houses have decided that the only thing that matters is this tiny, irrelevant country. It's not an attack on the country. I do wish Israel well. I always have, and I still do. But I am pretty offended by that behavior because they're supposed to be representing me and my fentanyl addicted neighbors, and they're not. And they don't care at all about Americans, our leadership. I'm not attacking Israel, I'm talking our leadership. So that's a totally fair position. And that is basically his position, or he's describing the frustration that normal people feel when they see that. And I'm good for him. The Jew hate stuff, I'm totally opposed to on every level, moral and practical. And I told him that. Whatever. So I'm not going to whine about how people are misrepresenting my views because that's who they are. But I personally think big picture, it's always good to get clarity about what people really believe, about what they really care about. We should know. We should know. And maybe you're more for them or more against them, but like it's the lying that bothers me. So I'd much rather have people just be totally straightforward about what their goals are. I'd love to see what's really in your heart. And I think we're seeing that much more than we did last month. And so for that reason, I'm glad we had the conversation, despite the fact, they're attacking my family, like for real, attacking my family, like for real.
Yeah, interesting. I'm very glad to hear that Tucker Carlson defends his conversation, explains why he did it, thought it was generally beneficial, but I will have to push back at him a little bit here. He said at one point there, I push back against the Jew hatred stuff. I hate that. He did, actually, but that's not Nick's position, actually. If you listen to what Nick says, and I'm deriving this from his interviews with the Hodge twins, from his interview with Tucker Carlson, who's sitting right there talking about this, and his interview with Dave Smith. Number one, he said specifically on the Hodge twins, I don't hate anyone of any particular race, or everyone of any particular race. That's not who I am. That's not what this is about. He argued that very, very overtly. You can watch that interview if you don't believe me. He also said, I don't believe in violence against Jewish people. It's absurd. He even had a segment recently where he talked about how it was stupid for someone to go up to Dave Portnoy while he was, an ardent Zionist, while he was doing one of his famous pizza reviews. One bite, everybody knows the rules. You guys have seen those. And he mocked and ridiculed the guy that said, F the Jews, and tried to interfere with that. He said, it doesn't do us any good. And if it was carried out into violence, that's even worse. We can't have that because the ADL just uses that in its toolbox against us. So he doesn't argue for violence. And he also said that it's not all Jews that are the problem. And this is evidence more than what just he said. He actually sat down with interviews with Glenn Greenwald and Dave Smith, both Jews, and had productive conversations with them both. He does argue that he believes that a lot of our foreign policy problems are due to what he calls Jewishness or Jewish influence on our political class, and I've argued profusely against that. Essentially, what I think by saying that is you necessarily take the culpability off where it belongs, and that is individuals that got the U.S. into these mass murder atrocities and caused so much damage and afflicted, multitudes with disastrous policies that are non-Jewish. And there are some Jews involved in that. But at the same time, when you say it's Jewishness, you take off the culpability of people like George W. Bush and Lindsey Graham and Dick Cheney and those people that were involved in doing the same things. We would not say to a serial killer, if a Buddhist convinced them to commit a murder, we'd still say, yeah, you're guilty of the murder. It isn't Buddhism that did that. So that's my critique against that. But I don't think it's fair to actually call Nick Fuentes necessarily a Jew hater. I don't think that. I do think he is wrong in some of his interpretations of where we should attribute the root cause of our foreign policy catastrophes on behalf of the Israel First movement. But at the same time, I don't think that's classic Jew hatred in the same way that it's purported, even to some extent by Tucker Carlson implying it here. But I'd love to hear what you guys think. Do you think I'm off on this? Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm wrong? Let me know in the comments down below. Either way, extremely happy this interview happened. People have said I sound like Sean Ryan. I've never heard that. I don't see that, but a lot of people have commented that on videos. Is that true, by the way? Let me know. Also, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Sean Ryan. Great interview. Thank you, Sean. I think Sean lives in Nashville. So do I. That's interesting. I've never met him, but great segment there. If you like this video, please consider joining as a YouTube member. You can do that by clicking the join button below. And if you do that, you'll help out the channel, which I graciously appreciate you for. And in return for that, I'll give you access to all of my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. Also, if you want a free copy of my first book, Compact of the Republic, click the link in the description below. It'll shoot you off to a site, plug in your email. I'll send that to you free of charge, no obligation, in PDF form, just because you're awesome. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.